So the Proa versus Trimaran debate has been raging on the internet since passive-aggressive typing was a thing. It's been rattling around in my head for quite a few years, ever since I started looking at Proas as a potential competitor to trimarans and catamarans, especially in offshore sailing. This video is relating specifically to trimarans, mainly because trimarans and catamarans are essentially the same, at least in how they relate to Proas. And I think it's generally accepted from what I've seen that trimarans have the edge offshore and catamarans have the edge on inshore sailing. And I'm more focused on offshore sailing and how Proas can potentially fit into that. So the modern philosophy is that if I take my trimaran and I remove the leeward float, then it falls over, which is probably true. But there's a lot missing from that equation, that if you actually design a boat that way, it can actually work, and it potentially, I think, can be more effective, more efficient, and one day I would like to prove that. The theory behind how a Proa could possibly compete with a trimaran is that for the same materials you can build something that is much larger. You can take the two very large armours, reduce them into a single very small armour, and then add that extra weight into scaling up the whole thing. So whether that's just adding some length to the main hull or widening it, whatever it might be, you can take that weight and those materials and you can expand the whole thing. So I just want to jump in here quickly and make a fairly fundamental point in terms of Proas. And it came up when I was talking to one of my brothers about these calculations, and he said to me, well, it's not a fair comparison because they're different length boats. And it kind of took me aback because that's quite literally the point, until I realised that obviously, to most people, the length of a boat is its most fundamental measurement, which to a degree makes sense when you're talking about similar boats with similar design principles. But you've kind of got to think a bit differently when you're thinking about Proas. The whole benefit of a Proa is that you can have a longer boat for the same cost, the same weight, the same ease of handling in terms of the size of the rig. And so there's no real reason why length needs to be the defining factor. If you're working to a class rule for racing, then it makes sense that a Proa is not really going to fit within that and have its maximum benefit. I do think that this kind of focus on length as being the fundamental measurement for a boat is kind of leading us down a weird path. There's a lot of box rules around now for racing where it's basically cram as much sail area as you can into a tiny boat, and you're ending up with these really quite fast, but they're not particularly seaworthy, and they're definitely not comfortable, and they're not even cheap. So it sort of, to me, defeats the purpose. If you can build a boat that's longer, generally speaking, a longer boat is going to be better in most cases. So you're ending up with these quite odd designs like the mini transits, which, they're bloody cool boats, but do they really make sense? Is there any reason why you couldn't have them 2 or 3 metres longer? The rig is ginormous. They've got a massive LED bulb on the bottom, and they're really just turning into giant bathtubs, which, yep, they're fast off the wind because they've got a big flat bottom and a huge rig and a huge riding moment. But is there any benefit to that than having a very similar boat, same beam, same sort of profile, but a longer hull? I doubt there's going to be much of a difference in terms of the cost. But anyway, it's just another thing to consider. But when you're talking about Proas, you really do have to start thinking outside the box. And that's where all us weird Proa guys are coming from, is that you can have a longer boat for much cheaper and much easier to handle than the equivalent trimaran or monohull. So in boat design, out of comfort, cost and performance, you can only have 2. So if you want a fast, comfortable boat, it's going to be very expensive. If you want a cheap, fast boat, it's going to be very uncomfortable. But I really think that Proas kind of push those boundaries a little bit, because for the same price, you can have something that's longer, which is going to make it more comfortable and faster. So if you do that, what do you end up with? So what I've done is I've taken some fairly detailed weight information on the various components of a 31-foot Corsair trimaran. I've built a 3D model of a trimaran and a 3D model of a Proa based on the same size rig and roughly the same material usage. There's a little bit less in the Proa, but essentially it's based around the cost and the rig, size of the rig. So what you end up with is this Proa. That is the very rough model, and this is the trimaran. The things to note are that the main hulls are exactly the same dimensions, other than that the Proa is extended aft about, I think it's about 30%. These armours are 220% of the overall displacement of the boat, which is about standard for a performance trimaran. Certainly these days you wouldn't want to go any less, so you can fly the whole boat on a single armour. So the numbers look like, so we've got a 31-foot trimaran. Using similar or even quite a bit less materials, you can build a 42-foot long Proa. Those are your main hull lengths. So the overall width of the trimaran is 7 metres. The overall width of the Proa, 8.5. Well, it's actually 9, but the centres of displacement are 8.5. Two armours on the trimaran weigh in at 330 kilos, which is a significant amount of weight, and there's two large armours. The small Proa armour, 50 kilos. And this is based precisely on the amount of materials, so it should be pretty accurate. You've got your rig, which is exactly the same on both boats. Rudders, well, you've got two rudders on the Proa. You've got a single one on the trimaran. So the main hull load. So generally speaking, a trimaran will have most of its load in the main hull, in the centre of the boat. Batteries, water, food, or equipment, sails, whatnot. You can obviously move that around when you're tacking. You certainly wouldn't do that in inshore racing. You'd do it to a degree probably with sails and offshore, but essentially most of your load is going to be in that centre hull. On the Proa, 50 kilos in the main hull, and that's because that's basically your essentials. Your water, your batteries, your sails, your equipment, your anchors, everything can be put on the armour, or at least out onto the very far end of the beams. Water ballast, put that at 0 for now, we'll come back to that. Armour load, so no armour load on the trimaran, 200 kilos on the Proa armour. Gives you the same total, 250. Crew's a massive variable. I've essentially just given them the same numbers, depends on how you're sailing. Some trimarans, especially the bigger you go with the trimaran, the more likely that the crew's going to sail from the centre hull. But then the crew weight becomes less of an issue. So this is something that's variable and depends a lot on the situation, but essentially they're going to be similar. Alright, so what does that mean? Overall weight of a 31-foot trimaran is 1,373 kilos, roughly. The weight of the Proa and the configuration that we saw in the model is just under 1,100 kilos. So you've got a 31-foot trimaran that weighs about 20% more than a 42-foot Proa. Let's say we have a light wind day. The trimaran is going to be bogged down, so you're going to have two hulls in the water. It's going to be heavier, it's going to be slower. The Proa is going to be significantly lighter and have less riding moment in light airs, so it can start to fly that armour much, much earlier, which gives you a massive increase in efficiency. So in light airs, the Proa will absolutely 100% beat the trimaran. There's very little argument you can make against that fact. If you add water ballast into the equation and you bring the Proa up to the same weight, to add 270 kilos of water ballast to the Proa, you end up with boats that are around the same weight. The Proa is 30% longer and has slightly more riding moment. Essentially, as I said, these figures are going to be pretty variable, so we'll say the same riding moment. You basically have a boat that has slightly less windage with the Proa and a longer main hull. If you want to look at basic formulas for how fast a boat's going to go, it essentially comes down to the weight, the riding moment, and the length. It's hard to argue that the Proa is not looking competitive on paper in this scenario. Now, where it gets really interesting, the Proa is going to be lighter in light airs because it's not going to have that water ballast. It's going to be able to fly the armour sooner, and as the wind increases, you can add to riding moment, and until you get to that max water ballast of 270, you're still lighter than the trimaran. So between kind of 10 and 20 knots, or 5 and 20 knots, the Proa should have the edge. After that, you end up with the same riding moment and the same weight, but a longer hull to work with on the Proa. Probably in flat water that might not make a difference, especially if the trimaran is planing, but in a seaway that should theoretically make a difference. It should also mean that you can push the boat a bit harder without having to worry about pitch bowling, which is an issue for highly tuned racing multi-hulls. So take what you will from that. And this is where, I'm not going to say the Proa necessarily is faster in this scenario, but it should at least be competitive. Should possibly have the edge, depending on the conditions. I'm all for people having a look at this, making comments, telling me I'm wrong in certain areas. I'm not saying these numbers are perfect, but I think that they're a pretty good idea of the differences between the two and the fact that the Proa should theoretically be at least competitive. Another factor that came up when I was talking to my old man about this was wetted surface area. So with the Trimaran and light airs, with 2 hulls in the water, it's going to have wetted surface area 12.26 square metres. With the Proa, again, light airs, so there's no water ballast in the Proa, and it should be able to fly this armour, 8.63. So significantly less wetted surface area. You've also got a streamlined run aft, whichever way you're going, that should be much more efficient. Now, as the wind gets up, that's going to change. If the Trimaran is flying its main hull, it will have less wetted surface area than the Proa. Proa has at maximum riding moment with its water ballast, where it's the same weight as the Trimaran. Flying a hull, it'll have just over 10 square metres of wetted surface area. The Trimaran, flying its main hull, will have 8.9 square metres, so it's about just over 10% less than the Proa. So essentially what we have is some numbers for you to look at in terms of the actual differences between these boats. Feel free to, make comments, point things out. I'm not actually that sensitive about this stuff. I think it essentially comes down to the fact that I'm confident in what I'm doing. I'm not necessarily confident that a Proa is going to be faster than a Trimaran or anything like that, but I certainly am confident that it's something that's worth looking into, and these numbers have actually really helped me to see that theoretically there is a lot of potential here for the Proas. The extra waterline length to me can't be understated, especially offshore, the way that the boat will handle in larger seas, the reduced risk of pitch poling, combined with the fact that with the Proa in the configuration that I'm working with, will not ever have negative riding moment. So what that means is that yes, it can capsize because there's other forces at play, a wave the wrong way, whatnot. But if you have a look at this, so this is my latest design in terms of a more finished product. The leaf oils that I'm working on with my smaller boat, I still haven't decided how I'll incorporate them into a larger version. This is my most likely scenario, so a lot less extreme than what I have on the other boat, but essentially still providing lift on that leeward side. So if we have a look at inclined hydrostatics of this boat, so this is how it will look at 15 degrees angle, 90 degrees angle. It's going to be floating on the pod. What that means is if you draw a line straight up, it's actually still going to have positive riding moment. Even though there's the weight of the rig will have a buoyancy component to it. But essentially, this should be self-righting, or at least not get to that negative riding moment point. So I can add the rig back into that. So you can see that rig is really going to stop when it hits the water, or at least slow down anything. Whereas a Trimaran, its windage is increasing as its riding moment is reducing, which is why they capsize a lot. Anyway, hope you found this interesting. Feel free to give me your thoughts on this stuff. I think it's a really poorly understood part of Proas, and something that I really hope that this at least shines a light on the potential and I guess the reasoning behind so many people actually believing in this configuration. There is a lot more to it than meets the eye. So yeah, let me know your thoughts.